U.S. President Donald Trump is ramping up the pressure in his bid to take over Greenland. He says he will be charging a 10% tariff on imports from 8 European nations due to their opposition to the U.S. taking over the Danish territory. In a post on Truth Social, Trump says in part that world peace and the national security of the U.S. are at stake because Russia and China want Greenland. He adds, starting February 1st, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK and the Netherlands and Finland will be charged a 10% levy on all goods sent to the US. This tariff will increase to 25% by June until Trump says a deal is reached for the purchase of Greenland.
Greenland not for sale!
Meantime, protests were held both in Greenland and Denmark, declaring the Danish territory is not for sale. Thousands came out holding signs and their national flag. One former member of Greenland's parliament says she hopes the Trump administration will abandon, quote, this crazy idea. She adds that the push to preserve NATO and Greenland's autonomy are more important than facing tariffs. Nothing, it's a fight for freedom. All right, let's now bring in Stephen Farnsworth, political analyst. Stephen, good evening and thank you for your time here on CTV News Channel.
Glad to be here.
So your view on how the president is using tariffs. First, we know it was all about trade and deals, and now tariffs are being used as a weapon to acquire other territories across borders.
That's right. The story that comes from the Trump administration about the utility of tariffs has really changed a great deal. Now it really is a vehicle to try to leverage outcomes politically that the president wants. It doesn't have to do with competitiveness or trade deficits or any of the kinds of narratives that were out there before. So this is a significant increase in the kinds of things that Trump plans to use tariffs to change the status quo.
Talk to us about how is this really helping the United States, Stephen, as its allies, we understand, are increasingly growing distant and huddling together in their point of view towards the U.S.?
Well, it's not clear that this is helpful in the issues of cooperation. There are other key issues to deal with respect to the world that you might look at, say, for example, greater pressure on Russia with the invasion of Ukraine going through yet another winter. But the reality for the Trump administration is that the president wants Greenland, and that's the narrative. You are seeing significant changes, though, within the U.S. Senate on this question. There was a bipartisan delegation that went to Europe to try to convince some of the European leaders that Republican members of the Senate may be in a position not to like this. Within the United States itself, you certainly hear a great deal of silence from Republicans. They are not full-throated endorsers of this idea, and so there is a question, I think, going forward of whether Trump will be able to convince even the Republicans to go along with this idea. So far, there's been either silence or opposition from some of the leading Republican voices here.
But here's the question, looking at the president and the manner in which he's been operating, Stephen, do you think he really needs to convince the Republicans, knowing that he does what he really wants to do?
Well, there are certain laws in the United States with respect to budget authority, and tariffs are one of those places where there are significant legal disputes underway on the question of presidential authority. In fact, there's a case before the Supreme Court right now.
Yeah.
A decision could come out next week or next month from the Supreme Court on the question of whether or not this unilateral imposition of tariffs, as the president has been doing over the course of this past year, is even constitutional, as it's legal under U.S. law. Certainly, if you look at the oral arguments in that case, there was a lot of skepticism from the judges that the president can change the tariff status at will without some sort of congressional buy-in through legislation. So we're waiting to see whether or not these tariffs are going to remain in place once we hear from the Supreme Court.
One quick question before I let you go. We were discussing about the relationships with allies, Stephen. We know that how president in the past has also spoken about NATO, his view on NATO. And of course, this is not a military attempt. This is economic warfare, as we understand. Nevertheless, it seems as though it is an attack on NATO allies. So what if it's economic?
Well, it's absolutely an attack. I mean, one of the things that really was the linchpin of the way the Western world operated for the 70 years after World War II was this idea that the security of all was best served by collaboration and cooperation. That's not to say there weren't differences during the Cold War and the years beyond the Cold War, but the reality is that what we're looking at now is a much more opposed to this historical tradition of pretty close alliance with the NATO allies, with the G7 allies, that this president simply does not see the value of it in the way Democratic and Republican presidents have in the past.
Indeed. Stephen Farnsworth, political analyst, appreciate your time and expertise, and thanks for joining us on CTV News Channel.
Thank you.